What's up, guys? Welcome to another episode of the Tactics Con podcast. You can find more information about the conference over at tacticscon.com. Today, we're talking to Dr. Joe Rigney. Dr. Joe Rigney, thank you so much for coming to hang out with us today. I appreciate you giving your time. I know you're a busy guy.
Hey, I'm glad to do it. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so today we're talking specifically about your new book that came out a few months ago, Leadership and Emotional Sabotage. But before we get into that, you are currently serving as a Fellow of Theology. Is that right, at New St. Andrews?
That's correct.
Fellow of Theology. What other responsibilities do you have up in Idaho? What else are you cooking? What else are you doing?
Yeah, so professor by day, pastor by night is kind of the rough and ready. So
okay. All the nighttime crisis counseling, they go to you.
Well, yeah, more just the bulk of my time is over at New St. Andrews, but I work for the Christ Church as well, and then so in with that, do some preaching, teaching, various capacities, some counseling. So kind of as an associate minister here. I'm actually being put forward as an associate minister. I shouldn't say I'm not that yet. Maybe I will be by the time this comes out.
Okay,
but I've been on staff for the year that I've been here at the church as well, and then coach high school football at Logos. One of the assistants there, and
that's awesome.
Various and sundry others work. Do stuff with Canon, all the kind of fun stuff.
Yeah, I don't know. I was telling somebody this the other day. I don't know of any pastor right now in our current context that is not bivocational in some way, shape, or form.
Right.
All of them got a bunch of hustles going on. And I think that's good. I think it's helpful. If I could ask you, so you've got a lot of things going on, but the way that I've seen you write and communicate, and I've watched some other podcasts that you've been involved in, you seem like a guy who has a goal. What would you say is your mission in life? Like, what is there this is my mission, Joe Rigney's mission in life?
Yeah, that's a great question. For years I would have said and defaulted and could still do so to, the one that I picked up from John Piper, spread a passion for God's supremacy in all things, and that's still very much true. I think at this point it would be, the sort of the way that we talk here in Moscow about build and fight as a kind of rebuild the walls of Christendom. So build culture, fight for culture. Both of those would be pretty key in terms of like the big picture. What am I a part of? I think the way that if you then said, okay, well, what's your role on the wall? What are you building? How do you build?
Yeah, that was going to be my next question.
So because everybody ought to be involved in that project. What's the thing that I do? I think that part of my gifts are in making complex things clear. And so, basically the big burden I feel a lot of times is to take complicated things, whether from the scriptures or in the world, and to make them as clear as possible for people so that they can live more faithfully before God. In terms of teaching, I've described myself, a teacher is someone who loves to tell others about the things that fascinate them. That's a teacher. And I'm a generalist, which means I'm fascinated by a lot of stuff. So
that's a good thing for a pastor, though. You kind of have to be a generalist to be a pastor.
Yeah. So whether in the classroom, the pulpit, writing, that's kind of where I slot myself in terms of trying to bring clarity to complex things in order that people might be able to live more faithfully before God.
Well, I appreciate that. So I've noticed you say that, and I've noticed that already in some of the interviews that I've seen you do with Pastor Doug. He'll say something, and then you'll zero in and say, "Okay, now what do you mean by that?" I can tell that you're trying to. It's almost as though you're trying to translate. You know what I mean?
So that's actually another good way to put it. Is that I'm a translator. I want to say things in other words that help people to get it. So
that's awesome.
Lewis always, I'm guided by Lewis in some of this, thought that pastors, a big part of their responsibility was translating, the Christian faith, Christian tradition, which, they may have read really high, glorious theology, but then how do you translate it into the vernacular? That's what Lewis was doing in a lot of his writings. And I feel that a similar kind of burden. So there's lots of things that I like to read that I wouldn't necessarily think everybody needs to read this. Instead, I want to be able to take it, frame it well biblically, and then and then pass it on. Some of what I
Well, that
actually was doing in this leadership and emotional sabotage
I was going to say,
is Exhibit A.
yeah, that is. Well, let's jump right into that then. So, leadership and emotional sabotage comes from, in a sense, the book by Eric Friedman, Failure of Nerve. Okay,
Yeah.
so it's kind of like that was the jump off platform. But what you did was you took, the concepts that he was talking about. Now he's coming from more of a historical Jewish understanding of the world. It seems like whenever I see him writing, and I appreciate how you took it and said, "Hey, let's put this in Bible terms. Let's connect this to the scriptures and say, hey, there's good general revelation in his book." But you took it and made, okay, let's make the specifics. Here's where these things coalesce with the Bible itself. So one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about as I'm reading the book, okay, so I own a business and I'm a pastor. Again, back to that whole bivocational thing. I own a business, I'm a pastor, and I see these applications from your book, Leadership and Emotional Sabotage, cross into both of those spheres, but far, far more in the pastoral side, far, far more. Why do you think that is? Or do you see a similar, do you see more of an application here in pastoral work than maybe the general economic sphere?
I think it would depend on, where you're at and what kind of company, what role you have. I think probably why pastors feel it more is that it's more universal. It's they're going to have the issues right in front of them in every church, right? So it's just like, this is how sheep work. this is how it goes. I think probably sometimes in certain business environments you can insulate yourself a little bit more from those pressures, because
or you can just fire them.
Or that's true too. Is that in business you can just say, hey, this isn't working out, you're done. In an easier way, whereas as pastors have to go, hey, we're charged to shepherd, and so how do we do that? Obviously, there is a firing of sorts if it's serious and gross sin, but oftentimes these sort of dynamics that we're dealing with aren't that, which is why they get so chronic and stuck in our systems.
Yeah, well, I appreciate in reading your book, so. It was almost like it was one of those things. We've seen this happening for years, but we didn't have the words for it. We couldn't say here's exactly what's going on. So one of the Friedman's fables, the example of somebody tying themselves with a rope and then throwing you the other end and jumping off the side of the bridge. That by far is the most common situation that I can point to. Well, that and the friendly animals of the forest. And if you guys haven't seen those, you can just look up Joe Rigney, Friedman's Fables. You can Google it, and it'll pull up a list of videos for you, and I encourage you to watch those. But those two examples seem to really, really sing well with me. I identify with them very, very heavily. But here's the problem that I've seen. Whenever you become the pastor who says, so let's say, you've been pastoring for several years and people have been getting away with that for a while. But then the light bulb goes off over your head. Maybe they read the book, maybe they didn't, whatever. But now you realize, oh no, you're not allowed to do that. You can't just hand me the rope. I'm not going to hold on to it. What I've found immediately happens is you're now the bad guy. Okay, in the eyes of a general, evangelical kind of squishy church, which is what a lot of them are today. What would you advise pastors who are dealing with that side of it now? So they've realized somebody's just tying themselves off, handing them a rope, and jumping off the side, and they've realized that they can't allow that to happen. But now they're being painted as the bad guy for saying, "Hey, you can't. I'm not going to hold this rope for you."
Yeah, so you have to recognize where it's coming from, which is a good place often. So the reason that folks react strongly if you say, I'm not gonna be held hostage anymore, is because of the compassion that Jesus sort of commends in something like the parable of the lost sheep, right? You leave the 99 and you go after the one, right? So hey, here's the presentation.
So here's the
is,
one,
here's the one. Saying, I need you, I'm hanging over a cliff, are you going to come save me? And so that's kind of the mentality that's kind of lurking behind it. Or another one would be, probably the strongest objection to some of the ways that like Friedman talks, and then the way that I've adapted is from things like when Paul says, in a stronger, weaker brother scenario, 1 Corinthians 8-10, that the stronger should bear with the failings of the weak, should accommodate, right? And so, and part of my book is, part of our pathology is is the modern tendency across society, whatever institution, to adapt to the most reactive and immature members of that community. So, and then somebody's gonna say, yeah, but isn't that what Paul says to do in 1 Corinthians 8? Here's the person who thinks that you can't eat that. And so you're going to say, I won't eat meat so that I can accommodate you. And so I think that's the thing that's kind of lurking in the background of why it feels unloving to say to someone, hey, I'm not going to let you hold me hostage anymore. You have to take responsibility for yourself. Now, so then how do you reconcile that? Well, I think one of the things is in those like 1 Corinthians passages, Paul's abundantly clear about what the truth of the matter is, even while he then temporarily accommodates the one who's weaker in faith.
And so he calls them weaker. He says, these are the weaker ones.
These are the weaker ones because of you associate that food or whatever with idolatry, and so you can't get over that. So Paul says two things: is one, you're wrong, right? The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. The stuff doesn't belong to the idols; it belongs to God. And so, as far as God's concerned, there's no reason for you to be bothered by eating food that's been passed through the idolatrous meat market, which is different than going to the idolatrous temple and participating in the worship. He says, can't do that. That's sharing the table of demons. But but if it's passed through there and it's just you're eating the leftovers, you're buying the leftovers from the market, he said, it's all fine. The food's not contaminated. It belonged to God the whole way through. And so he says, you're wrong. And then he says, but there's a deeper right than being right. And so I will accommodate at some level your scruples in order to win you, to love you, to care for you. Now, and so I would say if we find yourself in that sort of circumstance, absolutely do it, right? That's precisely what you should do. You should say, hey, your conviction on this is wrong, but I understand where it's coming from, and I'm going to make allowances for it, budget for it, and not cause you to stumble. But oftentimes we want to do the thing is that we then take that up a notch and say, no, we need to agree with that person that they're right. That part of the accommodation is validating their way of viewing the world,
or agree to disagree.
Yeah, and so that's where you get subject to the hostage situation, where now in order to love you, I've got to validate everything you say and feel. I've got to agree with it. This is the untethered empathy trap, which is what's holding that guy when the guy jumps over the edge. Is I can't let go because this is now my responsibility, and a big part of what the push is in the book is you need people to take maturity is taking responsibility for yourself. And so calling people to maturity is part of what pastors ought to do. And to say nobody gets a pass. Yeah. Nobody gets to say, well, I'm the one person here who doesn't have to take responsibility for themselves because I've been wronged in these ways, or I've had these experiences, and therefore all of my, like when I sin, I'm off the hook and I'm the most sensitive. And so your sin is, or so my reactions are your fault. And it's like, that's God doesn't treat us that way. Everybody's going to stand before him. Everybody's going to give an account for what they've done, what they were responsible for, which in the case of leaders means you're going to give an account for how you led. So it doesn't mean everything's to blame in your church or your household. It's not that everything's on you in that sense. It's not blaming, but you are responsible for it. And that responsibility means when it shows up, you move to address it. So I think that there's some kind of a corrupting of a good, compassionate, leave the 99, go after the one, accommodate the weaker brethren that's underneath it. But it's become unmoored and reoriented by kind of the modern corruptions of virtue.
Yeah. So let's put this in like hyper practicality. So let's say that you're a part of a church that has become convinced that there should be wine in communion. Okay.
Okay. Yep.
But you're just getting there for the first time. The church has never done this before. You've got I would say you've got to teach on it. You've got to just say, hey guys, this is what the Bible says. We're going to sit here and put time into this and make sure that everybody gets the pages right. But even after you teach on it, there's going to be folks in the room who are going to say, I'm just not there yet. Right? Like I'm not ready to take that next step. And so like one option would be to say, all right, we're going to do both. And we're going to do both for a little while. We're going to try and bridge the gap to help you get to the other side. But then after that, after a season, you say, okay, here we go.
Yeah.
We're pulling the rug out. We're gonna take our next steps here. You think that's a wise approach to a situation like that? I'm just trying to make it very, very practical.
Yeah, no, I think it is. So at my former church in the Twin Cities, we did both. The outer ring was grape juice, inner ring was wine, knowing that we would have because knowing we'd have people there who might have conscience issues or background issues that would prevent them doing it till they die. And so it was like this is how we're gonna make that accommodation by saying, hey, it's permissible and good and to drink wine, and that's what Jesus gave us. But we're budgeting for that weakness in our practice here at Christ Church. It's a similar thing, although it's the trays are wine, but if you need grape juice, it's in the back, so it's even a little bit more centered, wine centered.
Yeah.
And some of that has to do with just the different kind of cultures in the community here versus the Baptist culture that I was a part of in the Twin Cities. And I think both of those are good ways of, on the one and the test is whether or not, how do you tell the weaker brother in that scenario is, well, do they want to impose their convictions on everybody?
Right.
Right. So it's one thing for somebody to say, hey, I'm a teetotaler. My parents were alcoholics and it was really bad. And when I was in college, I got really drunk and therefore I can't touch the stuff at all. And it's like, great, we got grace for that. There's room for that. But then if
you're the weaker brother.
But if the next step is, and everybody else needs to see things my way, then now you've kind of crossed from weaker brother territory and you start running into Pharisaical territory, where you're sort of erecting false traditions that nullify the Word of God. And so you've got to be able to distinguish. And this is again part of the Friedman stuff, is being able to distinguish between someone who's a real victim and you've got all the time in the world to help, comfort, and care, and then someone who's leveraging victimhood as a manipulative tactic. And this is a really hard thing to discern sometimes. This is what wolf in sheep's clothing. When Jesus says that, he's saying that sometimes the wolves will not look like wolves. It's not like they're going to, sometimes, when you show the cartoon of that, it's like, the Far Side cartoon, it's like the wolf is obviously a wolf with like a sheep draped over his head. And it's like, everybody's going to see that. No, what if it was actually a wolf that looked like a sheep?
Right.
You would go, that's a tough thing. It's a hard situation because all the externals, and then you're going to have other people who are going to insist, no, that is a sheep, it is a sheep, and they're going to keep telling you, and you're going, no, it's a wolf, no, it's a wolf, and I'm resisting the efforts to hijack, but you're getting the pressure, and that's often the most difficult pressure is from other soft-hearted Christians, other soft-hearted shepherds who don't yet see what you're seeing.
Yeah, well, and it puts the requirement for both the ability to lead and the ability to lead wisely on the pastor at such a high level. There's such a tremendous, so I've been pastoring for about 10 years now, and the more that I'm here, the more I realize there is so much wisdom required in order to do this effectively because of what you just said. What's the difference between a sheep and a wolf? Well, I think it's right here, and I can't tell if it's happening in this situation yet or not, but I'm watching. And then to be able to lead your people along, like whenever you do say, hey guys, remember your friend Tom, who's been coming to church with us for the last 3 years? Turns out Tom's a wolf. Watch out. Things are about to get wild. That's very, very difficult to be able to lead effectively through as a pastor.
Yeah, well, and I think that's where if putting the focus on bringing clarity, just to tie that back in, is I think a really helpful thing. And the clarity comes not necessarily by identifying so-and-so as a wolf, but by doing something that they'll out themselves.
Oh, that's good.
Right.
That's very good.
Right.
Okay.
So in other words, if you're in a situation where people are confused and it's just a big muddle, and it's like you've got faithful sheep there, you're the shepherd, you got faithful sheep there. You've got confused sheep who have kind of bought into some stuff, but they're sheep. You've got wolves in sheep's clothing. You've got good, faithful pastors. You've got nice guy pastors who sometimes can behave more like hirelings. They can have what I'll call hireling moments.
Yes.
Right. Hireling tendencies. Yes. And it's not. And when you say hireling, it's not because I think they're getting paid off. It's not money, but it is respectability. It's credibility. There's other benefits that come from kind of keeping the peace, where they cease to be simply a peacemaker and they become a peacemonger. Okay, that sort of distinction is in play. And you've got all of this running.
Yeah. Yeah.
in your church. Okay,
Yes.
well, what should you do? Well, this is the moment where you're going to try to pursue clarity, and the clarity comes by saying something true, that if there is a real wolf, if there is a real destructive cancer in the system, it will come to the surface. You don't have to. So say something that's going to make everybody, that's going to bring the eruption. This is part of, in the book I talk about moving from sort of sublimated conflict under the table, to conflict on top of the table.
Yeah.
Put the conflict on the table.
Yeah.
And Paul does this all the time. You watch him in the book of Acts. The riots that he quote unquote causes, right, are simply, he knows the button to push and realizes it's going to be helpful for me to push that button. Same thing's true of what's going on in Galatians when he confronts Peter, right? There's this kind of subtle pressure, really, where is everybody? Is Peter a hypocrite, or is Peter a false apostle? That's the question, because he's withdrawing from the Gentiles. Where's Barnabas at on all this? What about the rest of the Jews? What did James say to him? It's all big confusing, but what's manifest is that Peter's withdrawn from fellowship, and this isn't good. And so what Paul does is he just comes in and he puts his finger right on it. Says, Peter, if you, though a Jew, if you know that we get into the Christian faith by faith, why are you expecting these Gentiles to keep kosher in order to be friends with you? Why? Explain it to me. And the idea is Peter needs to have a good answer for that. It needs to be something like, and so like he needs to be able to justify it, but it's bringing submerged conflict into the light in order to bring the clarity. And if Peter had doubled down on the practice, which I don't think he did, I think he relented. I think that's why we see him relenting in the book of Acts. Peter's leading the fight against the Pharisaical false brethren in Acts 15. He's the one who's like, no. Why? Well, I think it's because Paul, they got on the same page. And so in that, though, Paul had to take the risk of saying the thing out loud and bringing the clarity, which then, if it's a confused sheep, then they'll respond with confusion, and then you can continue to work through it. If they react and it start attacking you, all of a sudden you might have a bunch of people going, oh, whoa, that's not a sheep,
right?
This is something else. This is something more dangerous.
Yeah. So it's about inviting the right type of conflict. About saying, hey, now we need to engage on this exact issue, putting your finger right on the button, and then moving forward from there. I like that. So I think, though, there are some people in, contemporary American churches today that are sabotaging their leaders, and they don't know it. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, I think they're doing it by accident. What would be would you apply the same principle to them? Would you say, hey, you need to have a meeting with them and put your finger right on the button and let them see what it is that they're happening? What's some ways that you would shepherd people like that?
Yeah. So it could be valuable to have a sort of a one-on-one sort of meeting, or little group session. But oftentimes one of the ways to help is actually more the teaching ministry, where you're going to preach in such a way that's going to put your finger on the issue, and you're provoking the reaction. But you're doing it. So the thing is, the wrong kind of conflict is when their eruption causes your own eruption, or that you're doing it reactively, right?
Okay.
You're taking it's personal. You're taking it personally, and it's a mess. Instead, if you're sober-minded and clear-headed, and you know where the issues are, and you just go, okay, I need to preach a sermon on this, and you preach it down the middle, and what you say is all true, and then it provokes the reaction. Then now you have the follow-up conversation, and you say, okay, so help me understand why I simply said some true things from the Bible, and you got really upset. Like, how have your loves and your hates and your sensitivities been calibrated? Is it the Word of God that's calibrated them, or is it the world? Is the world calibrated your? And so you're offended because I just violated some cultural, sacred cow, and so you're feeling the tension there. And so what you're doing there is, and it's not personal at all. There's no, you're just patient as the day and long. This is the Lord's servant must not be quarrelsome, but able to teach, patiently enduring evil. They may be saying all kinds of things, but you're just patient. And why? Because you want them to be delivered from the snare of the devil. You want God to open their eyes. You want God to grant them repentance. And so you're able to be steady, kind, faithful in that private setting, but you've been bold, because you've been bold and courageous in the public one, where in the public setting, that this might cause that person to blow up, but there's 5 other people in your congregation who need to be encouraged that the way that they're thinking biblically about something, because they're wondering, are we weird? Are we wrong? All the world is running this way, so maybe we're wrong. And they need to hear you say from the Bible, here's what's true, and to have their, weak knees strengthened, their backbones given a little boost.
Yes.
That's an important part of the pastoral office. And so you're doing multiple things there. You're strengthening the saints. You're exposing perhaps wolves. You're exposing confusion in sheep, and then you can deal with the fallout as it comes. But that's the sort of thing that I would have in mind in terms of getting clarity on what you're dealing with.
Yeah, excellent. Well, Dr. Joe Rigney, I thank you so much for your time, man. I know you got something coming up. I want to go ahead and end this now. Guys, thank y'all so much for listening. If you're looking for more information about the TacticsCon conference, you can go to tacticscon.com to buy tickets for next year's conference. And if you've got any questions for Dr. Joe Rigney or future podcast interviews, you can email those to me at stuart@page50.com, and hopefully we'll be able to provide you with some feedback. Dr. Rigney, thank you so much, man. I really appreciate your time.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yes, sir.